This might be my all-time favorite video, cooking video to make for you. This is my nanny's stuffing. She was famous for her stuffing, and then I became famous for her stuffing, and now you are going to become famous for her stuffing because I'm going to show you how to make it, and you can make it for years to come. So, just right off the bat, there's a couple things. If you hear that in the background, I'm also roasting some garlic in the air fryer. Pay no attention, focus on this. So, we're gonna use chicken stock, butter, celery seed, poultry seasoning, salt and pepper, celery, onions. They can be white, they can be yellow, probably not red. Stuffing cubes, and then I like to also throw one of these little, crunched up kind of stuffings in. And kind of the secret ingredient, believe it or not, is a box of stovetop. But don't let that fool you. We only use stovetop because it has that real strong, spiced, whatever in it. Like it's the packet of seasoning. So it's like a really concentrated chicken. So your first thing you're gonna do is boil 6 cups of chicken stock or chicken broth. Stock has vegetables in it, broth does not. I always like to work with stock. So we're gonna do 6 cups of this. We're gonna do a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, and poultry seasoning. I don't have amounts for those. You're just gonna have to eyeball it. I would say minimal on the salt, a little heavier on the poultry seasoning, but don't go crazy because later on we can add more once we start tasting it and figuring it out. So 6 cups of this, I'm gonna get this on the stove and then I'll be right back. Okay, the recipe calls for 6 cups, but I'm gonna do 8 cups because if you want your stuffing crusty and a little on the dry side, which we don't in my family, then you can pull back on the liquid. I put a little more liquid in than is necessary because then I can do it to taste. You'll see what I mean later on. It's gonna be a texture preference, but if you find that you got it too wet, never panic because you can always just bake it longer and dry it out a little more. I already washed this. With your celery, I just leave it intact because I'm gonna use probably use most of this. And all I do is just wash it real good inside, which I've already done, but I just will show you. And then I shake it out pretty good. And then I'm gonna lop the dead ends off. And so I'm gonna leave it like this because it's easy for me to hold and it's easy to stay, in one bunch. And then I just slice it like this. You wanna make sure you get it very thin, not big chunks, nice and thin. This is the first time I'm ever using a mandolin for this. I bought one. Normally I do this by hand and it takes quite a minute, but this is actually a game changer. Do you see how thin this is? That's about how thick you want it. It's gonna melt right in your mouth. And we want about, I think, 4 cups of finely sliced, I gotta hold it up against me, onion and finely sliced celery. So I'm gonna do both of those now and then I'll move on to the next step. So you'll wanna bring your broth or your stock to a boil. Once it's at a boil, just cut it off and put a lid on it. You really just wanna keep it hot because it's going to be what, smells good. It's gonna be what makes your stuffing, obviously makes your stuffing soft. So bring it to a boil and that's that. Your butter, we are going to saute the onion and the celery with some seasonings in the melted butter. So right now, the first thing I'm gonna do is melt this butter and then I'll be back to show you the next steps. And so you'll do 4 cups of nice and thinly sliced onion. So on this mandolin, I'm just actually slicing this whole thing. Look how nice and thin these are. Look at that. That's perfect. That's exactly what you want. I just cut them in half. Do the whole onion and then cut them in half. You want them just nice and thin. Okay, this is the butter, melted butter with the onion and the celery, and I just sprinkled celery seed on it. So now all that butter is gonna get emulsified into this nicely thin onion and celery. And by the way, I used a mandolin for the first time in my life and cut these onion and celery in about 3 minutes. 4 cups of onion, 4 cups of celery, and normally that took me a lot of time. So this is such a wonderful tool, and I'll never not have one in my kitchen again. So maybe have this on like medium heat, a little over medium, because you want it to be sauteing. So once it's cooked down, I'll show you, and I'll come back and show you how it should look, and then we'll go on to the next step. I just wanted to talk about the stuffing cubes. I used 1 potato bread and 1 just regular old like white bread. And then these are white and wheat breads with herbs in it. So it's just interesting. I love potato bread, so sometimes I mix it up. Sometimes I use all white, sometimes I use potato bread. It's really just up to you. For this year, I'm using 1 and 1. It's just really to taste. Okay, so you know I always have these giant stainless steel bowls. These are really good to work with. Unless you have 1 giant bowl, you'll need to divide it into 2. Okay, get your breadcrumbs in there. At this point, I usually sprinkle a little more poultry seasoning on these and just mix it up. Once my broth and celery and onion mix is done, I'm gonna have to pour all of that into one. Well, I could probably fit it into 1 bowl, but when I go to stir it, it's super heavy and hard to do. So I divided it into 2, and you'll probably want to invest in some good bowls like this as well for making this dish. Okay, at this point you'll want to go ahead and just make the stovetop stuffing and get it out of the way and let it sit. I always make it to the recipe, but even when I just made this by itself, I always add a 1/2 cup more of water than it tells you to, or else it's just super dry. Okay, now our celery and onion is coming along pretty good. All that butter is in there. Do you kind of see how the onion is very tender? So we just want to continue to let that go a little while longer. It's just about done. Okay, so if you'll look at this onion and celery, it's done. So I took it off the stove, and now I'm going to divide it in half amongst these 2 bowls. But see how it's fairly mushy. But I taste it and make sure that the celery still has a nice crunch to it, so we're good. Now I'm going to divide it in between these 2 bowls, and then I'll come back and show you the next step. Okay, and make sure you scrape all of the good butter out of the bottom of that pan. Now, ultimately, this is going to be all 1 dish, so don't worry about, oh my gosh, did I get more in one than the other. We're just putting it in 2 for ease of stirring. So now that we have that, we're going to add our broth. And remember, the recipe called for 6 cups, but I did 8 cups because I want to give myself a little bit of leeway and be able to have a little more and make it a little more wet if I want to. All right, so now we're gonna take this, give it a nice stir in case some of the seasonings have settled to the bottom. Okay, ouch, it's a little hot, so we're gonna get our oven mitts on. All right, and I'm gonna just coat the cubes 1 go round. All right, and give everything a nice stir. Get it all incorporated. So I'm going to stir this one, I'm going to stir this one. Then once I have them incorporated, I'll be back to show you some more. I want to kind of tell you how to gauge how wet it needs to be. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put all 8 cups in here. And you know, I did use an extra bag of stuffing, so that's gonna make a difference. I used that one little extra bag of stuffing, and then you can see, oops, you can see and I kind of like to smush it a little bit so they're not staying exactly cubes. Okay, and now what I'll do, this is about how wet you want it. Now, don't be like, oh my God, it's soaking wet, it's so soggy. It is soggy, and that's how you want it. It's not gonna stay that way. Now we have to let it sit for 15 minutes. So once we let it sit for 15 minutes, all of that, let's dump one into the other, get rid of the 2 bowls now. All of that liquid is going to absorb into these bread cubes. Get all this good celery out. So at this point, you need to do some taste testing. You just want to make sure, does it have enough salt? Does it have enough pepper? Or does it have enough poultry seasonings? They will be the only 3 ingredients and seasonings that you put in this at this point. The only other seasoning you put into it was celery seed, and you did that in the sauteing step. So now I like to grab a fork and give it a little taste. See what it might need. It's pretty perfect. I'm gonna say a little bit of salt. Why not do a little bit of everything? A little bit of salt, a little bit of poultry seasoning, a little bit of pepper. Let me wash my fork off. Mix that in. Try it. Oh my God, it's so good. Okay, we're gonna let this sit covered so it can soak in for 15 minutes. After that, we're going to take the stovetop stuffing and mix that with that. We're gonna put it in a 13 by 9 by 2 and pop it in the oven. Okay, now that we've let this sit covered for 15 minutes, we're gonna dump the stovetop into it and incorporate that into the whole thing really nicely. Then we are going to dump it in that pan and stick it in the oven. And I will show you that in a minute. Okay, that kind of just slid right into the bowl, pan. 13 by 9 by 2. You do not have to grease it or anything. And so, once it is in the pan, then you just kind of want to make sure it's like that. I don't want to smooth the top. I kind of like to make some crevices. And now we're going to put it in the oven, 350 degrees, uncovered. So you want it to get a nice crust. So 350 degrees, uncovered, and in it goes. We're going to leave that in there for probably 30 to 40 minutes and give it a look-see when it's done. You'll know. Taste it. If it has a nice crust on the top, you're good to go. And that's it. Okay, and then this is the stuffing out of the oven. If you want to zoom in on it, you can hear it. Nice crusty top. And beautiful. And that's it. That's Nanny stuffing. Ooh. Enjoy.